Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. This is kind of the perfect time of the day. Not too late, not too early. Hopefully everybody's awake and not too hungry. So let's start. And I'll start by saying that this is probably the least technical session you see at this conference. There's exactly one slide with monotype fonts in it. And the reason for that is that I'm basically going to tell you a little story, right? And the little story is a pretty honest retrospective about how we went about conceiving, building, and adopting a big data solution basically for our clients, right? And the punchline could also have been, okay, I'll use this. The punchline could have been this as well, right? How do you actually change the pace in a maturing organization when it comes to trying to build innovation, right? From the perspective of a larger group that has his own momentum, has his own inertia, and so how do you tackle that, right? What are the techniques or frameworks you can use to solve this type of problems? So let's start really quickly with the introduction. I obviously didn't put too much effort in this slide. This is the monospace font in the middle here. That's all you're going to see. I'm Francesco. I'm currently a development director at the workshop. We have a little office here, nice, in Malaga, and another one in London. My background is in doing architecture, though, and today this session for me is about wearing this dual hat between actually designing these solutions and seeing how these solutions can be actually rolled out to a larger audience. The workshop is a not so small independent platform and solution provider. We serve a global array of gaming operators, and that means that in a sense, we don't just build bespoke software for our clients, we also help them understand how they can best market and operate their businesses. The Workbench is the department that I'm happy to lead. We try to build good gaming platforms, and I think it's pretty much time to begin, and we'll begin with the actual story, right? And the story for me begins with me joining this company actually a little bit more than 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, as usual, when you join a new company, you kind of carry along with you the baggage of what good looks to you, right? And you start observing little things, and you say, oh, I could do this better. I think there's a gap here. I think there's an opportunity there. And after a couple of months, you say, oh, why aren't these opportunities being exploited, right? Why aren't these problems that you see in front of you being solved in a consistent way? And it turns out that as a technology company, we're actually pretty good at doing large overhauls of products and services. So we are not scared about learning new technologies. We are not scared about actually doing big programs. But when we do these big programs, it's usually very disruptive, right? It's disruptive for our clients. It's disruptive for us. And I don't think that's the way we want to operate, really, right? So what I kind of wanted to get to is, how do we make this so that from one side, we keep our clients happy, we keep our engineers happy, and we can do it at a sustainable pace. And so to drill down a bit in the specifics of the example I'm going to use today, and I'm going to use this example for, I think, 3 reasons, right? The first reason is because as a problem space is large enough to be interesting, it's also small enough and cohesive enough so that we can actually reason about it in a meaningful way in a session like this. And the third reason is also that there's a bit of a hype right now. I think, so the topic is this, right? I think there was a session before that also discussed about e-commerce fraud in a sense of risk. There's an obvious momentum right now in the industry about risk because for reasons that we'll discuss right away. Let's first start with, describing a bit the background of what e-commerce fraud means. And e-commerce, is a very large industry. It's a $1 trillion industry globally. And e-commerce fraud is, it stems from the fact that accepting payments for virtual goods is actually very risky. And it's risky because there's no chain of trust between the merchant that accepts a payment, the good that is being delivered, and the entity that actually makes the payment, right? It's very hard to track this sometimes. And, of course, there's different types of fraud. And I think, there's many ways maybe to classify that. But for us, I think the classification can look something like this, right? You have identity thefts. Every year there's at least a bunch of global sites that get their accounts database stolen, and there's a pretty thriving market about people buying these identities to from one side purchasing firearms or to do some other illegal activities. But one of them is also doing e-commerce fraud. The second category is actually friendly fraud, right? And friendly fraud, it doesn't really mean anything, but it does actually, because it's about users that actually don't want to do anything bad, they just forget, right? So the typical use case here is that I buy something online, and then next month I look at my bank statement, and I see a line in that statement that, I don't know if I did that. So I call my bank, and I say, I don't think I did that. And the bank usually, it's a pretty safe place for users to be in, and they usually roll it back, right? So if it's a credit card transaction, they'll basically close a chargeback to the merchant. And a chargeback is basically what is causing financial hit to merchants in the first place. The third category is financial fraud, which is a very large bucket, arguably, but it's important to distinguish between these last two categories because although in a credit card scheme as well, they both end up in being chargebacks for the merchant, so money that the merchant has to give back. It's important to distinguish the underlying reasoning, right? You don't want to be punishing good customers because they made a mistake, while you definitely want to prevent malicious attempts of the fraudinho, right? So that's an important distinction there. And the important distinction is that we want to be able to make decisions based on the fact that these two different categories are actually very far apart in a spectrum of features, right? So, as I say, this is a not so old, but reasonably old industry. It's probably as old as e-commerce itself. And traditional countermeasures or 1.0 countermeasures are very reactive, right? And reaction here means that you observe a bunch of transactions, and then you learn something from them, and that would mean, okay, then I have to stop the number of attempts for this guy for this many credit cards during the day. Or you can say, oh, maybe I don't like transactions coming from whatever country or whatever region because I think they're risky. And ultimately, there's a lot of manual review, right? There's stats that say that up to 80% of merchants globally rely on manual screening of transactions to prevent fraud. And the reason for that is that traditionally, preventing fraud in an automatic way is very costly, or is perceived as very costly. The true cost, though, here is that globally, e-commerce fraud costs 1% to 5% of this trillion global industry. As I said before, is obviously an opportunity there in the market, and there's a fair amount of vendors right now that are actually building 2.8 countermeasures, right? And 2.8 countermeasures come in different shapes and formats, but they're kind of shifting the paradigm over, okay, let's stop trying to be reactive and let's try to identify those patterns that we can use to predict things. And ultimately, it's a prediction problem, right? You have a set of features that describe users and their behavior, and you want to say, how likely are these things to turn sour on us, okay? So really, for me, the moment in time where I realized that the time was right for change, at least in our organization, was when I went to a fintech conference years ago. And over drinks, I got to meet this director of risk for Badoo. It's kind of social dating network, some of you might know. And she said, oh, but we manage a lot of operations with 3 people, me included. And to give a comparison, back then, our clients probably would employ 10 to 20 times more the people to manage a similar amount of volume of transaction, getting similar results, right? So I say, oh, why is that? No? Why is that we don't try to change this? And that's where they all began, in a sense. No? I really started to asking myself questions about why we don't feel comfortable that we can tackle these problems in a predictable way without being disruptive, and yet providing this value to clients that is obviously there, right? Why is no one taking this opportunity? And I think with hindsight, so this being a retrospective really, it's like, okay, what do we need to start with? And I think the first thing you need to start is thinking about a little startup, right, in a mature organization. And the first thing you do actually is you pitch your vision, right? And building up a vision, that there's a lot of literature out there about why you need a vision and how to build it and how to communicate it. So it's beyond the scope of this session, but what I want to focus on here is, in this little example, what it means to build a vision, right? How do you make it so that you don't only yourself have a vision, but also people around you understand what the vision is? And I think the first thing you have to do is starting with the problem, right? And the problem for us was this, right? There's a very long feedback loop here between people doing something on our systems, people understanding what they were doing, and actually causing an impact because of the insight that has been gathered from the data underlying the user behavior. It can literally take months, right? And months is not probably the worst case scenario, but imagine a scenario where, we understand that this is happening, and we actually have to change some applications. Regardless of how fast you can be, as soon as you involve an engineering group in it, like saying, I need to change this, and maybe there's a sprint, and when we do Kanban, whatever, it can literally take months, right? It's very easy. It seems impossible in 2017 that it takes months, but it does take months sometimes, not everybody. And why is this important, right? Why is it important to have a very good grasp of the problem and being able to actually communicate what the problem is? The thing is that if you don't understand what the problem is that we don't want this, right? The problem is that we don't want to have this long feedback loop. It's important because then you have to start with why. And again, there's a good book, Start With Why. If no one has read it or someone hasn't read it, I recommend it. It's pretty interesting. But basically, you need to start with why, because if you don't understand that the real problem is this whole loop, then people might be inclined to think that they need a different database without looking at what's outside of it. And otherwise, if you see here, in a BI function, for example, you might be inclined that you just need a better reporting tool. Or actually, you might blame it on engineering, saying, oh, actually, these engineers are very slow. It takes a lot of time to build these applications. But actually, what it means is that you shouldn't be having this long handoff of information in the first place, right? You have to have this big picture so that people don't lose focus and just concentrate on the little bit. And that's pretty much what my job was for the good part of a year, right? Convincing people that this is what we want to do. After you've done this, right, it's okay, I know that I can comfortably reason on the problem and explain why you need to change. What is the next step? And the next step for me was, actually building metaphors, right? Really dumbed down metaphors here. And, we'll see in a moment, I think that some of you can understand what the Swiss Army knife is, but, really, it's like, it was going in there and saying, are we using the right tools in a holistic sense, right? And I think that this is the context that some of the organizations, maybe not most, fortunately, but some of the organizations still today struggle to reason with, right? It's not about the tool per se, it's about the function that the tool serves, right? And in a sense, if you follow this very easy metaphor, it's okay, I have this little Swiss Army knife, it's good enough to cut a small branch, right? But is it good enough when I have a log? And the funny thing is most times, when people don't think about the big picture, they might actually try to cut the log with a small Swiss Army knife, right? And they get halfway through and they say, oh, that doesn't work, right? And they still try though. And it's very inefficient. This is one of the reasons why these large overhauls sometimes fail, is because we don't realize what the underlying message should have been. And the context for us was actually like this. And you can guess that this is a relational database, right? And relational databases, unfortunately, have been stretched in 15 different directions over the time. And we've bent them so much that they can do a lot of things. It's very flexible. There's a nice query language. But that very same query language has caused the fact that now we have these very large schemas and databases that we can't really scale up, down, whatever, because they're complex to manage, right? The fact that you can relate objects within a schema, it's nice at the beginning, but then it's very hard for you to say, I have to add the new data stream. How do I do it? Now, what is the impact on this data set? How do I create it? I mean, the result is that it gets progressively slower to write to and slower to read from. And that's not really what we want, going back to the big picture, right? The problem is not optimizing the database. The problem is looking at what's outside of it. And that's when we latch on the buzzwords, right? And the buzzwords here are big data. Big data for us is not really a technology enabler, right? But big data is like a way to define a different approach to decision making in a sense. It's a way to define a change in roles and responsibility about how people interact with data and make decisions based on them. And ultimately, it's a technique a very simple technique that you can use for people to latch on a concept, right? In the sense, this is really a buzzword, right? It's pure buzzword. And I think it's pretty effective, right? Because a lot of the time, some of these conversations happen in rooms where people don't really understand the details, don't really understand the technology. But at the same time, if they have a single concept that they can latch on and relate to so that, they can convey this bigger message, I think it's very helpful, right? So, okay, we've done all of this, right? We have this little vision that we can, work on and communicate and build momentum around, but what is that we are missing now? Like, is that all the thing, like, can we just take this and do it and, everything is working fine? What are the impediments or the challenges here around getting something like this done safely? And there's going to be 3 of them, right? And the first one is pretty obvious, right? It's about technology selection. And the reality is that technology selection is getting ever more complex, right? So this is not even updated. It's nothing, it's not even complete, in fact. And yet, there's this huge landscape of choices that you have when it comes to, cherry picking capabilities and solutions to build a big data platform. And there's two reasons for that, right? One is vendors, right? And being an independent shop, we do use vendors, but we like to use them wisely. And there's of course a space for vertical platforms that provide a wide array of solutions. But the truth is that a lot of these problems have been solved somewhere else, but yet we build another one. And that's also because as technology people, we also like to build stuff, right? So we love building new frameworks. And the truth is that we have a lot of frameworks right now to choose from. And the question is, how do we navigate this map so that we, out of these 100 sort of possibilities, we just pick enough that, can cut the job for us? There's some, considerations around the fact that each of these products can be actually bent the same way the SQL could be bent in the past. The stick can be bent, right? We can have a graph that, represents a taxonomy of users. And now if I have to, for example, store KYC documents, I could use something else, but I can actually store it in the graph, right? So it's native graph, but it's also non-native document store. And the same time series are, kind of another hype nowadays. There's time series native databases out there, but you can also do time series with Cassandra. And Cassandra is, doing pretty good PR about, how good Cassandra is for time series modeling. And, truth is that, it can be good, but the definition of good depends on you, right? It depends on you to understand how you want to use that time series and whether that time series today looks the same as it's going to be looking in 2 years. So how do you do it, right? What techniques do you use to do this technology selection? And I think the first one is, starting with the big picture. And this probably is not, it doesn't need to be a pretty graph, not because this is pretty, because I make it, but I think it's something that allows a framework of a conversation, right? So when we look at a big picture and we start reasoning on the underlying guiding principles and patterns, we can more easily get aligned on what capabilities are actually needed and actually when do we need certain decisions to be made by, right? And again, I don't want to, this is not, the purpose of this presentation is not to walk you through, how the architecture is laid out. There's been many presentations out there about that. We can walk quickly here. There's a user that does something on an application. We want to ingest events. We want to store events in an event store. And then there's this traditional Lambda architecture here with some stream processing, some aggregate, and some specialized database to store the manipulation of those events. And then there's the batch processing part of the Lambda architecture, which allows data scientists, BIs, to reason on top of those batch updates. And there's some nice dashboard as usual, right? So we'll see what it means, right? But really, this is not the point. The point is that when it comes to starting building this type of project, I think it's important to understand, okay, what are the building blocks that I need? Right? What are the capabilities that are really needed for me to achieve these bigger goals? And I think a big picture does that, right? The other considerations you need to make is about skills, right? It's not about the existing skills because as learning organizations, we give for granted that we have to learn in a sense, but it's important to understand what the gap is, for example. It's important to understand what the learning curve is going to be so that it's compatible with timing, for example. And the other thing we cannot ignore is whether those competencies exist in the market in the specific location you're involved in, right? When it comes to hiring, for example. So the second step is about the underlying complexity of the data, right? And when big data kind of came out as a concept, you just had volume, right? And volume was, how much data do I need to store, like petabytes or whatever. And it turns out it's not about the volume. It's, there's 5 Vs. 5 Vs is a model that, kind of grasps the inherent complexity about data. So you have the volume per se, the velocity at which data arrives, and you have the veracity of data. So can I trust the data that I'm receiving as a binary option, or should it be something that is a bit more fuzzy, right? And then there's the variety of data. I mean, it's not the same of capturing a consistent stream of logs than it is to capture logs, device information, video, and other media content, for example. And the overarching topic here is the value, right? Not all data is created the same, right? And because of these underlying 4 factors, the way we treat this data is fundamentally different sometimes, and we have to be aware of that. And these considerations we have to make when it comes to adopting certain technologies. So this is about the complexity of the data itself, right? I take a piece of data and I look at it to say, this has this complexity, fair enough, I understand it. But what about the extrinsic complexity, sorry? And the extrinsic complexity, I'm just citing 2 here, but there could be 15 other things, right? For example, okay, we are discussing e-commerce fraud. What are the confidentiality issues that you have to consider when manipulating and sharing this data with a group of people? What are the regulatory and security considerations that you have to make? What about availability? Availability meaning, can I rely on the fact that this data can be stored without looking at regional independence or client independence, for example? I have to partition it somehow. These are all things that aren't traits of the data per se, but are about how you're going to use the data in your applications. And the third slide is about experimentation, right? And I think experimentation is fundamental in this process. I think that the only way you actually get operational understanding of how to do something is by doing things with it. So building proper proof of concepts. And building proof of concepts means getting operational and production understanding. It means understanding whether, also famous CAP theorem out there, actually, what does it mean in practice for us in the application we're about to design? And as usual, the devil is in the detail. No? The devil means that if you just look at a product brochure, you might be inclined to think that, and we had someone over the last few days speaking about this, and JEPS is a fantastic framework for that. It's like one thing is what you think a solution can do, and the other thing is actually what it does in practice. And the last point is super important, right? Is making a conscious safety check about whether you really need that piece of technology in the first place. And we'll talk about this in a bit further down. So this is the second impediment I want to talk about, right? Not impediment in a sense, but a challenger in the adoption, right? And it's about the users, right? Going back to that long feedback loop, right? A major part of that equation is actually the people that use this data on a day-to-day basis to make decisions, right? And the users, back then, they looked like this, right? A traditional BI team with a fairly narrow skill set, mostly about Excel and SQL, no surprise, relying on a few coarse-grained aggregates. And the type of work these guys do is, as I said, reactive in nature. So we build reports, we look at them, we build alerts, and we tell someone that something's going on, right? Not really, part of the big picture originally, but it still stands out that these guys still exist. Right? They have to learn the trade, and learning the trade doesn't mean just necessarily upskilling people, right? So when it comes to switching from BI to data science, in a sense, there's this acceptance that there has to be a broader array of skills that people adopt. It's not about just a business understanding or programming with a larger variety of programming languages. It's also learning about better math and statistics, so we can do better modeling, and so we can also remove the bias from the data, for example, and things like that. But the real gain here, and that's, I think, the most challenging problem of all this session, is how to make it so these people actually observe a change in the paradigm, right? The change in the paradigm is that we don't want to look at more data. We don't want to build more reports or faster reports. We don't want those reports in the first place, right? We want to focus on building actionable insights. That means we have these guys have to remove themselves of the equation of decision making and just make sure that they can be able to monitor and refine these models in a meaningful way. And I think that the few techniques that you can use in this sense is, first of all, finding champions in those teams that, can actually latch on your idea and help you build that team, right? Without that, it's very hard, especially if that team is geographically dispersed in a sense. And the other thing that at the end of the day, you have to do is learning some of that craft, right? So if people don't trust that machine learning is a good technique for making prediction, surprisingly, it's still the case sometimes. You have to learn some of that craft yourself, show them how they can do their job, how that job can actually be made better because of these new tools, right? And that, I think, is a very powerful message that, not just to users, but also to stakeholders can be given when it comes to building up and maintaining this vision that, we're trying to push out. Third step is maturity versus innovation, right? And this is where I put my development director hat in a sense on, right? Because, as I said at the beginning, maturity is a well-understood concept. There's, some studies, this is one of the studies that, relates product innovation with process innovation. And the truth is that, it's hard to do innovation when the organization itself is moving at a different pace, right? It has moved on in this little graph here, which I'll explain in a second. All these graphs tells you is that, there's the first phase where, the vast majority of innovation happens in a product, right? And that's where a startup would be, right? A startup invests in innovation without looking at process so much. At some point, roughly when these two lines intersect, there's, a dominant design that emerges out of the sheer number of all these products that have been built. And the e-commerce float, for example, is a nice example, right? I think we are getting to the point now where there is a dominant design emerging. And after this phase, you have the transitional phase, which basically, okay, as an organization, I've built the core benefits of this product. How can I be more efficient now in refining this product, with incremental improvements? And the truth is that the organization I work with largely is, getting here, right? We are starting to refine process so that we can deliver incremental improvements as opposed to large overhauls. But, there's a diminishing return in the product innovation you get out of it. The last phase is basically cutting costs. Not cutting costs, but, making it more efficient by, saving money in building the same products, right? So this is not really interesting, right? But again, we have to acknowledge that sometimes we have to make this leap, right? We are in a phase, organizational-wise, and we want to make a step backward. And that was the overarching challenge that we had some years ago. So again, we've understood all of this. Okay, so ultimately, okay, yeah, I missed one. We understood all of this, right? We understand that there's a maturity implication, there's a technology problem to be solved, that there's people that need to learn new things. What is the last step now before we can actually start? Or actually while we actually do it? And I think that the last step is the focus, right? Focus is not about just building the first seed of excitement in people. It's actually to maintain the seed of excitement over time, right? And I think a lot of the experience that I have with innovation itself, this is what it fails, right? You build the first excitement, and you definitely don't want to be the person that wins the party, So you say, oh, it's going to take 1 year, it's going to be awesome, and then 1 year later, oh, nothing happens. I'm so disappointing, So how do you maintain focus? And I think the way you maintain focus is actually stop thinking about a product, right? So MVP actually is not a word that I like to use nowadays. And I think we have to focus on building a minimum viable solution. And the difference between a solution and a product is that the product captures, in the ideal scenario, in the ideal of people, something that is complete, but it's usable, it has designs, it has all the whistles and bells, but really the core benefits are at the center, right? The fundamental source of innovation of what we do is a very few set of capabilities, and everything else, I wouldn't say is noise, because if you want to make this for a living, you need to have those whistles and bells, right? You do need to invest time in building a nice UI, and you need to invest time in making it usable for people that are not as proficient as you expect them to be, but that needs to come later, right? And I think that if you focus on building a minimum viable solution, it's kind of a safety net for you to just avoid making that mistake. And what does it mean to focus on building a minimum viable solution? I think that is to focus on outcomes and on outputs. So, building less sometimes is better, right? And outcomes here is the sheer capability of what you're building. It's about building value incrementally. 2017 again should be a well-known concept, but sometimes it's not. Measuring early is important, right? Because again, going back to feedback loops, it is important to have these feedback loops as tight as possible. And the experimentation with real data is also important, because this is not just about engineers and DevOps learning how to operate a different array of data sets, for example. But it's also about the end users that need to learn how to use this data in a meaningful way before it becomes too important or too large or too complex for them to learn. So I think that the best way you have right now, that we found we had, to build this, to build like a mini startup team, right, within this larger organization, and give them a very clear mandate, and in a sense, allow them to cut through bureaucracy a bit, right? So we don't need a larger process to manage, to manage incremental improvements, because the incremental improvements are, self-contained in this core benefit circle. And the other safety net is making sure we avoid bigotism, right? And bigotism is this tendency that, in a sense, we all have to make it better, right? So every time we get to work on something new, we say, oh, we're going to add this so many features that I wish I had in the past. But actually, they're not probably here in the middle. They're probably somewhere outside, at the periphery of this circle. And avoiding bigotism is what actually keeps you lean, in a sense, right? And so what does the minimum viable solution for us, how did it look like when we first rolled it out, right? And it's pretty underwhelming, right? And it's underwhelming on purpose, right? The fact that there's no, and we'll see how this maps out in the original big picture, but all we did at the beginning was say, okay, some of these data points about a user we were already capturing, right? We added more. We stored them in a graph, really. Okay, I don't know what happened with this. We stored them in a graph. There was a chat, I think, a couple of hours ago about Neo4j and how to store taxonomy of relationship of users, so I won't get into that. But I think the underlying value we get from all of this is that we can build a very simple classifier, right? We can build a very simple thing that allow us to solve these actually core benefits, right? These are the long feedback loops we had, right? So things like identifying a fraud ring, or things preventing bonus abuse, or protecting my users from account takeovers. These are tangible benefits that you can use so that you can actually say, okay, we got to this point, these are the benefits you get. Now it comes the time to invest in a larger suite of products around these core capabilities. And going back to the big picture, I think the outcome here is that first we want to prove something. Prove that we can do it, prove that we understand it, prove that it actually provides value, and then engineer it. And it turns out that machine learning can actually be done in Excel, right? There's a nice book here, this one. It's a very nice book. I don't like Excel personally, but this book made me change my mind, no? Because it turns out you don't need a lot of data to do machine learning. You don't need big data to do machine learning. You don't need big data to do a lot of the things that we wanted to do. And the other important part, besides the various technology, I mean, there had to be some icons in this presentation because of the conference. So there's some technology. No, it's not me. There's some technology in here. I'm happy to discuss afterwards about what we made these choices, for example. But it's kind of beyond the scope of what we're trying to do. Apex, for example, is not even, it wasn't even in the MVS, right? It's something that we're adding now. But what's more important for me in this picture is not what's in there, is what's not in there, right? The fact that there's no Kafka, for example, the fact that there's not a lot of other things, it's all there is for me, right? The fact that we were able to make a conscious decision about whether Kafka back then was the core benefit we would get from this solution is, for me, already a success. The fact that you choose not to adopt something is as important as choosing to adopt it, right? And it's what allows you to reduce the effort involved, not just in developing some of these platforms, but also to, develop the necessarily operational understanding of what it means to operate them, right? These are, in isolation already, fairly complex pieces of technology. And, you have to be conscious about what it means to just, dump this massive, nice platform on people that have never seen it, right? And again, the focus is on the core benefits, right? So the end of the story, really, right? The end of the story, and this is very quick, right? The end of the story for me is that there's three steps, right? And 3 is the magic number. Now it has to be 3. It cannot be 2, it cannot be 4, so I cannot make it 3. And there's 3 steps, and the first step really is about understanding a couple of things before you start. Do I understand the problem well enough that I can be reasoning about it? Do I understand the context well enough so that I can tell if the timing is right, if the capabilities are there, if I can get the buy-in from the necessary people? If you don't do this, simple fact-checking, sometimes you just start thinking that it's going to be a success, and then you find out that no one is interested, right? And again, waste of time, and not really positive energy. Second step is really about projection, right? And projection is, how do I make it so that it goes inside out? No? Everyone here maybe has his own opinions about what's good, right? But if I just keep it for myself, it's never really relevant. No? The exercise we have to make is sharing this underlying belief with other people. And projecting is how you do that, right? And projecting means starting with why, again. It means being able to articulate this vision in a meaningful way depending on the audience, for example. Yes? And then finally it means experimenting, right? Experimenting, again, is key, right? If you don't experiment, you might be making choices that ultimately aren't fit for purpose. And finally, there's the execution phase. And, a startup theory says, ideas and big ideas phase not because of the idea itself, they phase because of the execution. And so execution is key. The ultimate thing we are paid to do, right? Is execute. And execution comes in, again, surprise, surprise, 3 steps. It's about focus, and not just the initial focus, but the ongoing focus and momentum. I think it's about measuring early and often, so that we can have these feedback loops. And measuring early really also is the stepping stone for the learn and adapt phase. And learn and adapt here means that we cannot just assume that because we made a decision a month ago, or 2 months ago, or 1 year ago, whatever, it's going to be always the best decision. Right? Sometimes you just have to say, okay, that was a bad decision, I'm going to change course. If you don't change course sometimes, you're going to end up with a big ball of mud that you thought serves some purposes. Maybe it serves your purposes, but it doesn't serve the end user purposes. And that's definitely not very useful, right? This, again, difference between outcome and output, right? We can do a lot of output, but if we don't have the necessary focus and necessary understanding, it will be just output. Now, it won't be very useful for other people. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take some questions now if you want. Thank you.
Francesco, if anyone's got a question, just please raise your hand and we'll come over and give you the microphone.
Easy.
Thank you again.
Thank you.